Hello everyone, today's lecture, Lab 9, is on the Lophotrochozoa. We're going to cover three phyla, ectoprocs, annelids, and mollusks. And the good news is you've probably heard of the animals that are in the annelids and mollusks before. And we will work out what this Lophotrochozoan word means. So we want to start by reorienting to our tree diagram of all of the animal phyla that we're studying, and go through some of the evolutionary changes that have happened between these different groups again. So remember that all animals are multi-celled heterotrophs with no cell wall, and that we're going to call the whole monophyletic grouping of animals the metazoa. Remember that porifera don't have true tissues, they have the cell aggregate body plan. But when we get to the eumetazoa, or true animals, we have organisms that have at least two tissue layers. And we start with radially symmetrical. Then we have a split between really the cnidaria and the ctenophores, but we're not covering ctenophores as a group in this class, and the rest of all of the other phyla of animals, which are not radially symmetrical, but bilaterally symmetrical, and they don't have two tissue layers, they have three tissue layers. One of those tissue layers are formed during early development, and they're endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. We looked at flatworms already, platyhelminthes, and they are in this taxonomic group, the Lophotrochozoans, although we didn't dwell on what that meant at the time. And we separated out our deuterostome phylum from our protostome phylum as well in the development lab, remembering that those are early changes in the way that development happens between these two groups, of whether blastophore turns into the mouth in the protostomes or whether it turns into the anus in the deuterostomes. Only two phyla are deuterostomes, echinoderms and chordates. All the rest of our phyla, except cnidaria and porifera, are protostomes. So we're going to be in the protostome clade today, and we're going to look at the biggest groups in terms of number of species, also in size, the mollusks and annelids, and then a phylum that has some really interesting little animals in it called the ectoprocs. Part of the reason we cover the ectoprocs is that this word, Lophotrochozoans, is created from characteristics that all of these phyla have. So not all of the phyla have a structure called a lophophore. Not all the phyla have a structure called a trochophore, but they have one or the other. So we've mooshed those two words together, and that the phyla that are in this clade, the Lophotrochozoans, have either a lophophore, which is a feeding structure, or they have a trochophore larva in their development history, evolutionary history. All right, we'll come back to the ecdysozoans next slide. All right, what is a lophophore and what is a trochophore? Well, when we look at our ectoproc animals, also called bryozoans, we see the lophophore is this part of the body. It's a ring of tentacles around the mouth that's used for feeding. So the lophophore is a structure that's shared by all of the animals in this ectoproc phylum. They're very tiny animals, and so you probably have never seen one before, and we'll just have a few pictures of them in the lab today. Now, the trochophore, we talked about larval phases in organisms with, a metamorphosis that happens, that the larva is the juvenile organism and looks very different from the adult. So this version of a larva is common to the other phyla, and it's called a trochophore larva. Now, if you zoom in on it and you draw this nice diagram, it looks like something. It looks like this little sort of trapezoidal shape. It has some little cilia on it. It's got a mouth. It's got an anus. And it is the trochophore larva. So remember, we had those Pluteus larvae with the arms sticking out on them. So there's all these weird different kinds of larvae with funny names that we see in marine invertebrates in particular. So it is a swimming larvae where we have taxa that have moved into the terrestrial environment. They obviously can't have a swimming larva anymore. So we say they've lost that larva. Maybe they do direct development now rather than indirect. But their ancestor was a marine organism that had a trochophore larva. All right, so these are the characteristics that are give this clade its name. All right, starting off with our very tiny ectoproct animals. So these are usually called bryozoans. Oops, bryozoans. And if you remember that we used to call our mosses, we called our moss bryophytes, then these are sometimes called moss animals. So when you see them, the most common one we have here in the San Diego area that you might see, you're going to find it growing on pieces of giant kelp leaf that are floating or that you find on the beach. And it's going to look like this whitish crust that you see. And if we zoom in on it, you see that it's rows of these little outlines. And each of these is basically a little apartment or a little box that the animal is going to be living in. So it's going to be sticking up its little lophophore out, and the animal itself is living inside the box. And when it's alive, it has a trap door that it can close and cover the top of that. So there's two different body forms or colony forms that the bryozoans might look like. They're going to be either they can form this crust-like one where all the little boxes are next to one another, or they can form a branching structure where instead of a sheet, they're like a little set of apartment buildings or condos, and the animals are going to be sticking out of these little stalks with bulbs on them. So they look a little bit like that cnidarian animal, the hydrozoan colony, except the lophophores, where we see them zoomed in over here, they have a very neat and tidy appearance. All of the tentacles are straight and they look very neatly combed and right next to one another. And there's many of them. When we look at the polyp of a cnidarian, like say Obelia, the tentacles are all squiggly, they're fewer, and they're separated out from one another more, and they look like they're having a bad hair day compared to the neat, tidy lophophore structure. All right, so these animals are all marine and they're only ever about 1 millimeter in size. So because they're so tiny, they don't have some of the body organs that we might expect in an animal that's actually this complex. They're so small that they don't need a circulatory system. They're so small that they don't need a respiratory structure besides just the surface area of the body. However, they do have a complete gut. They don't do locomotion in the sense that they get up and move around anywhere, but they can pull their ring of tentacles inside their little house, or they can push it back out again. So they do have some muscles that attach the animal into its house. Let's see, so they filter feed, or they grab little particles out of the water. They have a complete digestive tract. They're going to, let's see, they do have a nervous system, a small brain-like structure and some nerve cords. They do have, they do both asexual and sexual reproduction. And again, they're so small that they don't need to have any special osmoregulatory or excretory structure. Right. Now, the phylum of the annelids has a lot more different species in it, and they're much larger, so you've probably seen these before, and they include the segmented worms and things like an earthworm. So the basic body of an earthworm is going to be worm-like in that it's long and thin, and it doesn't have any arms or legs or limbs or anything sticking out from it. And you'll be able to see that its body is sectioned into little parts. And so these are the segments, the segmented worm. means that it has these little sections. And one of the things about segmentation is that we often see that there's repeating structures in each of the body segments. And the annelids are very classic example of a segmented body plan. They do indeed have the same structures repeated in each of their body segments. So it's like we put together a train made out of all cars that are all the same as one another. Where we have repeated body parts like these, sometimes evolution is able to make changes to different body parts, and you end up having a much more complicated body form, or we have taxonomic groups where we have a lot more diversity. So the earthworms basically all look like earthworms, and they haven't really taken advantage of this potential for diversification. However, when we look at the arthropods, one of our other A phyla, we'll see that they have taken this segmentation and that they have really taken advantage of it, and that they have developed these incredibly varied bodies with different legs on different segments, and that we see incredible taxonomic diversity that has arisen from that segmented body plan. However, the annelids have not ever yet, perhaps. All right, so the most exciting earthworm I could find a picture of is this blue one from Australia. And in this clade, we see not only the terrestrial earthworms, but a large group of marine worms that have been called polychaetes. Now I put it in quotes because I'll show you in the next slide that the group we thought was a monophyletic group, now we no longer think it's a monophyletic group. So its name is a little bit up in the air right now. So the ancestor of all of the terrestrial segmented worms was a marine worm and of this polychaete group. So a characteristic that is ancestral in the segmented worms is the chaetae or setae. And when we have polychaetes, they have many of these setae. And setae are little hairs that are going to stick out along the edge of the body of the animal. So the oligochaetes, which is the class name that is earthworms, have few chaetae or few setae. The polychaetes have a lot. So some of these organisms in this group are things that we call bristle worms, reflecting the amount and size of the chaetae that they have. The other terrestrial group that is in this phylum are the leeches. So Hyrdinia is leeches. And earthworms are kind of straight and skinny all the way across. Leeches are going to be a little fatter in the middle and skinny at one end. And they do have suckers on them because they are a parasite, and they are going to rasp onto a host and suck either its blood or its body fluid out. Right? So leeches are parasites. And earthworms are free living. So just like in our phylum of the Platyhelminthes, another kind of worm, we have the turbellary that are flat living, and then we have the cestodes and trematodes that are parasitic and have a modified body. The other structure that both the oligochaetes and the Hyrdinia have is the clitellum. And so a clitellum is a structure that sometimes you see on earthworms. It looks almost like there's a Band-Aid wrapped around them. It's a thicker part and it's smooth. You don't see the segmentation on it, and that is the clitellum. All right, so polychaetes don't have that. The clitellum is a place where the sexual reproductive structures are located in the body, and it secretes the mucus that's going to surround the little cocoon of eggs that are laid. So all of the clitellata are hermaphrodites. So we're going to have earthworm mating. There's going to be two individuals come together, they exchange sperm, and they crawl off. So another way to say that is that they are monoecious. They have both male and female reproductive organs in the same body. All right, so we have three taxonomic groups that are the polychaetes, and then the oligochaetes and Hyrdinia. And this is what has ended up happening to their taxonomy. So we used to think that the polychaetes were sort of one twig that was coming off of this branch, and that the oligochaetes and the hydrogynia were sister taxa. They're within this larger clade, the Clytellata. But more recent DNA sequence data has shown that there's much more structure within this key. So for example, or in this tree. So we have, say, here the serpulids, and there's another monophyletic group that's branching off from them that includes these phyla, or sorry, these groups, which might be classes or might be families, and so they're not monophyletic groupings. So what the thing we used to call polychaetes isn't a monophyletic grouping. So we would have to call the entire tree polychaetes, and we might as well, if we're going to do that, call them annelids. So exactly how this is going to be worked out has been still up in the air at the time I was writing the lab manual. All right, so let's look at some of these organisms and look at the log branch characteristics for this phylum. So these animals are capable of doing locomotion. They have body space, a coelom. They're true coelom animals, so it's filled with water, so that holds the body up. So we can talk about them having a hydrostatic skeleton. And we have a closed space inside the body that's full of fluid. It actually has a little pressure against the walls of that space, and it'll hold the body up, much like a water balloon will be held up off of if you set it down on a surface before you throw it at somebody. So they have this hydrostatic skeleton. That means although they don't have any bones or reinforced hard body structures, that they still can hold themselves up. So they're going to have muscle tissue that is going to be connected to plates in the body that allows them to move along and crawl. For osmoregulation and excretion, they have a body organ called a metanephridium. They actually have a pair of them in each body segment, and they have a little opening on the side of the body for that urinary waste to get moved out. So they have a pair of urinary openings on every segment along the whole body. So they're peeing out many, many, many places as they're crawling along. Right? So metanephridium, that's their body organ for osmoregulation and excretion. For gas exchange, they actually are going to use the moist surface. They're going to be secreting mucus. They have a high level of blood vessels that are going to be touching the inside surface. So they're going to have the moist skin. It's thin, and they're going to do respiration across it. So they don't have a lung or a gill. They're going to use their whole body surface as their respiratory organ. Digestive system, they have a complete gut. It's a pretty obvious body organ that's going to be going down through the entire structure. And since we have a complete gut in this phylum, we see that they start to have different parts along that length of that digestive tract that do different jobs. For example, they have this slightly more swollen area that's called a crop, which is where they're going to be able to store a little bit more food. It's going to be able to allow them to eat more at one time, kind of like our stomach. For reproduction, they do sexual reproduction, and they have, and they're monoecious. For identification, we already went over their sort of little cartoon of what these animals look like, and they're pretty easy to tell apart. They do have a nervous system that consists of a cerebral ganglion, which is like a brain, a tiny brain. Ganglion is a tiny brain. And then they have this ventral nerve cord. Ventral means more towards the belly. So we have a dorsal nerve cord because it's towards our back. They have a ventral nerve cord. And then they have additional ganglia, which are little tiny brains, little swellings that are going to be capable of doing some information processing in each body segment. So when we talk about segmentation, we say, oh, they have a metanephridium in every segment. Even in structures that sort of go throughout the whole body, we see that there is still some kind of repetition of structures that is repeated across each of those body segments. They don't have eyes, but they do have some ability to do sense organs, and even their CT that are sticking out of the side of the body can tell if there's something pushing them or not. So they're mechanoreceptors like a cat's whiskers. See. Circulatory system. Okay, they have a closed circulatory system. And that means that they have blood vessels that are going to be pumping with a sort of a heart towards the anterior end. These blood vessels can contract and it's going to cause movement of the body fluid. So we say they have a closed circulatory system. And that means the blood is maintained within the body, the vessels during its entire trip around the body. So we see them as distinct blood vessels. They have a dorsal and a ventral major vessel. And then again, they have repeated down every segment. They have a pair of lateral vessels that connect the top ones and the bottom ones. All right, so those are the basic structures. We're just going to use earthworm as our animal to do our log drench characteristics on, because things get a little weird and complicated when we start looking at all those different kinds of polychaetes and leeches. Let's look at some pictures of those polychaetes to make sure we recognize what those look like. So there's basically two kinds of polychaetes. Some of them are called tube worms. And they are worms that live in tubes. Thank you, people who name these kinds of things. And so our examples of tube worms are these ones that are over here on the right-hand side. So we see just some sort of feathery tentacles sticking up from the end. And those are going to be feeding structures while the body of the animal is going to be down inside of its tube. These can be very tiny. They can be these little spirally ones on the bottom, which are actually only a couple millimeters across. Or they can be quite large. And often these are the kinds of things, if they have their tentacles sticking up, if you tap them, they pull the tentacles down inside. They can also live in the mud. So they basically make themselves a tube to live in the mud. And then they're going to have little tentacles sticking out, and they feed on the sediment and detritus that's on the surface. So those are our tube worms. Now our other group polychaetes are like the one on the left. And this is one where it's easy to see why they're called polychaetes, many CT. So it's bristly. So this one is called a bristleworm, and they move around. They're quite aggressive predators, and usually they're just called polychaetes, not tube worms, or they're called errant polychaetes, ones that are moving around. But you can see the body segmentation on it quite easily. And so it's a cousin to our earthworm. It's just a lot more bristly. The leeches, they resemble earthworms in that you can see the external body segmentation. They aren't covered with all these extra bristles, but they're a little wider towards the middle. They have a sucker at each end, and they're going to be parasites. They have a jaw they actually can use to rasp onto through the skin of whether it's a plant or an animal that they're going to be a parasite on. So you just need to be able to recognize these and know that they're annelids, and the class name is Hyrodinia. All right, our third phylum for today is the mollusks. Mollusks are one of my favorite phylum, and they include basic body plan of an animal that starts off in its evolutionary history like a snail with a shell. So its basic body parts are the head, the foot, and then it has a mass called the visceral mass, which is inside underneath the shell, protected by the shell. The animal secretes the shell, so it's fastened on to the body like our fingernails are fastened on to our nails and our fingers, and then the bottom, if you look at the mollusk from the bottom, you see this large muscular foot, and it's capable of acting as a suction cup. So a lot of the snails that are most common worldwide are marine snails, and ones that live at the seashore living on rocks are also incredibly common and diverse group of marine mollusks. And that big muscular foot allows them to stick onto those rocks very tightly and survive in areas even where there's a high amount of waves crashing on them. All right. So they are going to have this shell. It's going to grow as they grow. They don't trade out of it. It has to grow along with them. And inside the shell, they're going to have some kind of a gill or modified gill into a lung. And the special name for the mollusk gill is called a ctenidium. But you can think of it as a gill. So that's their respiratory structure. On land, they have this gill is modified into sort of a pseudo lung or a false lung, but it's still major single structure of their respiratory system. They're going to have a complete digestive tract. And one of the interesting structures that mollusks have is that they have a rasping tongue called a radula. And it's modified to be used in different taxonomic groups so that it can be used for predation. It can also be used for grazing. So the snail-like animals are going to be crawling along and they're going to be rasping, they're going to be licking the lettuces in your garden and scraping off little pieces of them and pulling it back in their mouth to eat. So the ones that live in those marine intertidal rocky habitats, they're going to be licking rocks for their entire life. And it turns out that the materials that make up the radula are some of the most abrasion-resistant molecules that we know of. And so people are studying the chemistry of those to find out ways we can develop better abrasion-resistant materials to use for different applications. So many of the groups within the mollusks have a head end that's obvious. They have some sense organs on the head end, so they're bilaterally symmetrical. They have I already talked about, for reproductive, they may have, so it's quite a variety. They do sexual reproduction, and they may be separate sexes. They may be hermaphrodites. It just depends on the taxonomic grouping. So quite a lot of variety in these species. We're going to look at 4 different classes within the mollusk. That's not all of them, but it's the ones that there's the most species of. And we're going to start with chitons. All right, so chitons are basically a foot, and then the shell that they have over the top of it is separated into 8 plates. All right, so they still have the shell, but it actually is more flexible and can hinge because these plates are separate from one another. So we'll find these on the rocks down in the rocky intertidal area, and it's nice for them to be able to curve their body like that, because as they're crawling over a rock, then they can change their shape. So the shell is going to go across the whole top of the animal. They're going to clamp down onto a rock when the tide is low. But when we look at that from the top, because the shell is in these different plates, it's going to make them look like their body's segmented, but it's not the body. If we turn them over, we'll see that mollusk foot on the bottom, and it's continuous. But the shell is in these different sections. So we'll see some pictures of them in lab, and you'll get a better idea of what those look like. Now, their name for the taxonomic group is called Polyplecopora, and that means many plates. Right? So the shell is modified into these separate sections. Another animal that's really common on the rocks in the intertidal zone, I often find it right next to some chitons, are limpets. And limpets are in the next group of mollusks that we're going to look at, which is one of the most speciose. There's the most different kinds of species, and that is the gastropods. So our basic snail-like animal is a gastropod. Limpets just have their shell in more like a hat shape rather than a spiral like we're used to seeing on snails. So limpets, again, they're going to be able to clamp themselves down onto the rock, and a little peaked or domed shape of their shell is going to be really good at shedding the wave energy that's pushing down on them from the water. And in fact, it even pushes them down on tighter. All right, so we have quite a few examples of gastropods. Now, most marine seashells that we think about are actually the shells of snails. And so there's thousands of marine species of snails with quite a diversity in how their shells look. In the terrestrial environment, the snail is going to be more of a garden snail-like animal. And we also have these slugs. So slugs are a group that has, over evolutionary time, lost the shell. So they came from an ancestor with the shell. They have lost the shell. They aren't just frolicking around naked without their shell on. They never have it. And this is possibly because they evolved in environments that were low in calcium and they couldn't have the materials they needed to make the shell. But we have slugs here in San Diego. If you have a garden, you've seen plenty of slugs. And these are nice, large yellow banana slugs that we find in the Santa Cruz area. One of my favorite taxonomic groups is the marine slugs, and they are also gastropods, but they're much, much prettier and variety of different colors and different sort of shapes and styles that we find. Most of them are quite teeny, right? But we do have these larger ones called aplysia or sea hare that we can see in the tide pools here in San Diego. So these are more examples of gastropods. Right, our next group is the bivalves, and they have evolved so that their shell is flat and comes in two parts, right? So they're called bivalved because their shell is in these two parts, and they have a hinge so that it opens and closes. There's 4 kinds of bivalves. You probably already recognize them. These names, you know what they are: oysters, scallops, clams, and mussels. And depending on the species, they're going to have a slightly different look about them. But most of the time, the animal can be completely enclosed within that shell for protection. And so it has a very reduced sort of body compared to the snail-like body. You can see they don't really have a head. They do still have a foot, and they use it for digging into the sand. And also for sort of, they can move a little bit with it, but they're not crawling around too much with those with their foot. And our last group, wonderful group of very interesting mollusks, the cephalopods. All right, so again, cephalopods has 4 kinds. It's easiest to remember them just by being able to recognize when you're looking at an octopus, a chambered nautilus, a squid, or a cuttlefish. And these are intelligent, fast-swimming predators. They have a more sophisticated nervous system. They have a large eye that is more effective than the sense organs of the snail, say, and they actually have a closed and efficient circulatory system. So when we look at these animals, they have evolved quite quite a lot from the basic body plan of the mollusks. And the easiest thing to do to remember that they're mollusks is to be able to recognize them and to know that they're in that group. So, oh yeah, that's an octopus. I knew it's a cephalopod mollusk. Now, cephalopod means head, foot. And basically that's all they are, is the head and the foot or the arms. And they don't have really a middle to their body. So that's what they get their name from. All right, that is our brief introduction to these 3 phyla for today in the Lophotrochozoan clade.